Blood on the floorboards usually meant her father was home. Today it meant he was dead. Abigail did not cry when the sheriff handed over Josiah's battered leather hat. She just stared at the gallows being erected in the muddy square, waiting for any kin of a stagecoach robber. Survival in Brimston meant making hard, ugly trades. So she traded her freedom to a man who had not spoken 3 words in a decade. A brute from the high ridges. The sheriff's office smelled of stale, chewing tobacco, wet wool, and cheap rye whiskey. Abigail sat on a splintered wooden bench, her hands folded in her lap. She kept her gaze fixed on the floor. If she looked up, she would have to see the bloodstains on the sheriff's boots, her father's blood. Sheriff Hoyt leaned back in his creaking chair, tossing a heavy brass pocket watch from hand to hand. Josiah's watch. The way the law sees it, Abby, a dog that runs with wolves, is still a wolf. Hoyt said. His voice was thick with phlegm and false sympathy. Your daddy robbed the Union Pacific payroll. 3 men died. You cooked his meals. You washed the gunpowder out of his shirts. That makes you an accomplice. Abigail remained silent. She was 22, but her eyes held the exhausted, flat stare of a woman twice her age. She had spent her entire life moving from one drafty hideout to another, sleeping with a loaded Winchester under her cot, waiting for the law to finally kick the door in. Now the door was broken. Josiah was lying on a slab at the undertaker's, and she was going to swing. I can offer you a cell. Hoyt continued, leaning forward, his breath hot and sour. Or I can let the townsfolk have you. They're riled up. A hanging is good entertainment on a Tuesday. Get to the price, Hoyt. Abigail said. Her voice was raspy, unused to speaking above a whisper. You don't want me dead. You want something. Hoyt smiled, revealing teeth-stained brown from tobacco. $50. That's what your daddy owed in damages to the town saloon. You pay it, you ride out of Brimstone, and I forget I ever saw you. $50 might as well have been 50,000. Abigail had nothing. Her father's saddlebags had been picked clean before his body was even cold. She looked at Hoyt's greedy eyes and understood. He knew she didn't have the money. He wanted her indebted to him. He wanted her at his mercy in a town where women without protection disappeared into back-alley brothels or worse. The heavy oak door of the sheriff's office swung open. The hinges screamed. The wind howled through the gap, bringing with it the bitter scent of incoming snow. A man stepped into the room, ducking his head to clear the doorframe. He brought the cold in with him. He was a mountain of a man clad in a heavy buffalo hide coat that made his shoulders look impossibly broad. A thick, untamed beard covered the lower half of his face, blending into hair that curled wildly around his ears. He smelled of pine sap, wood smoke, and tanned leather. His eyes, peering out from beneath the brim of a slouch hat, were the color of slate. Cold. Unforgiving. He didn't look at Abigail. He walked straight to Hoyt's desk. Every step was deliberate, heavy, but entirely silent on the floorboards. He reached into his deep coat pocket and pulled out a leather pouch. He tossed it onto the desk. It hit the wood with a heavy metallic thud. Hoyt blinked, startled by the intrusion. What's this, Hayes? 50 bucks, the man said. His voice was a low rumble like boulders grinding together at the bottom of a river. Hoyt opened the pouch, his fingers trembling slightly as he spilled heavy gold and silver coins onto the desk. He counted them, his brow furrowing. This is $50 all right. But what for? Caleb Hayes turned his head slowly and looked at Abigail. His expression did not change. He didn't look at her with lust or pity or anger. He looked at her the way a man assesses a horse before a long, punishing ride, assessing her bones, her stamina. Her Caleb said. Hoyt laughed, a sharp, barking sound. You want Josiah's girl Hayes, you come down from that mountain twice a year for flour and salt. What the hell do you want with an outlaw's daughter? Wife. A single word. It hung in the dusty air of the office. Abigail's stomach tightened. She had heard of Caleb Hayes. He was a trapper who lived way up near the timberline, in a place where winter swallowed men whole. Rumor was he had fought in the war, seen things that tore his mind to ribbons, and retreated to the ice to get away from the stench of humanity. He was known to be violently territorial. He was known to be silent. A wife! Hoyt repeated, leaning back. He looked between the gold on his desk and the imposing figure of the mountain man. He didn't want to cross Hayes. Nobody in Brimstone did. Well, legally speaking, if you marry her, her debts become yours. And since you just paid her debts... Hoyt shrugged. She's your problem, assuming she says yes. Both men looked at Abigail. She stood up. Her legs were shaky, but she locked her knees. She looked at the gold on the desk, then at the gallows visible through the window, and finally at Caleb Hayes. He was massive, intimidating, and a complete stranger. But he wasn't Hoyt, and he wasn't a hangman's noose. Cynicism was her only armor. Men always wanted something. Her father had wanted a cook and a sentry. Hoyt wanted a helpless victim. Caleb Hayes wanted a beast of burden for his cabin before the snows hit. Love didn't factor into it. It was a transaction. Blood for gold. Freedom for servitude. I need my father's rifle. Abigail said, her voice steady. And my own horse. Caleb stared at her for a long moment. Then he gave a single curt nod. They were married 10 minutes later by a terrified circuit preacher in the back of the general store. Abigail wore a dusty riding dress. Caleb didn't even take off his hat. The preacher rushed through the vows, terrified of the giant looming over him. When he asked for the rings, Caleb simply pulled a plain iron washer from his pocket and shoved it onto Abigail's left ring finger. It was cold. It fit perfectly. I pronounce you man and wife, the preacher squeaked. Caleb turned and walked out the door. He didn't wait for her. He didn't offer his arm. Abigail looked at the iron ring on her finger. It wasn't a promise. It was a shackle. She grabbed her father's Winchester from the counter, slung her meager pack over her shoulder, and followed her new husband out into the freezing wind. The ride out of Brimstone was brutal. They didn't take the main road. Caleb led them straight up the eastern slope, cutting through dense thickets of black spruce and lodgepole pine. The elevation gain was punishing. Within 2 hours, the air grew noticeably thinner, biting at the inside of Abigail's lungs with every breath. She rode a raw-boned roan mare she had bought with the last of her hidden stash, while Caleb rode a massive draft cross that looked like it could pull a freight wagon up a vertical cliff. He rode at the front, his posture rigid, never looking back to see if she was following. Abigail gripped the reins with freezing fingers. Her leather gloves were worn through at the knuckles, and the wind felt like a knife dragging across her skin. She didn't complain. Complaining got you hit. That was the rule in Josiah's camp, and she assumed it was the rule here. She kept her head down, her jaw clenched so tightly her teeth ached, and focused on the rhythmic thud of the horse's hooves. By mid-afternoon, the temperature plummeted. The trees began to thin out, revealing jagged, snow-capped peaks that looked like shattered glass against the bruised purple sky. The isolation was absolute. There were no tracks, no distant chimney smoke, no signs that any human being had ever set foot on this mountain. Abigail felt a suffocating wave of panic rise in her throat. She was entirely at the mercy of this silent giant. If he decided to slit her throat and toss her into a ravine, no one would ever know. The roan mare stumbled on a loose piece of shale. Abigail pitched forward, barely catching herself on the saddle horn. The horse let out a panicked whinny. Up ahead, Caleb pulled his draft horse to a halt. He sat motionless for a second, then dismounted. Abigail's heart hammered against her ribs. She reached instinctively for the Winchester in its scabbard. This was it. He was angry. She had slowed him down. She waited for the reprimand, the harsh words, the raised hand. Caleb walked back toward her. He was huge, moving with a silent, fluid grace that belied his size. He stopped beside her mare. He didn't look up at Abigail. Instead, he knelt in the mud and sharp rock. He lifted the mare's front hoof, running a massive, calloused thumb over the frog, checking for a stone. Finding nothing, he set the hoof down gently. Then he stood up and looked at Abigail's saddle. He reached out and grabbed her stirrup leather, adjusting the heavy brass buckle, lengthening it by 2 inches. "Legs are cramping," he muttered. It was a statement of fact, not a question. He didn't wait for a response. He turned, walked back to his horse, swung into the saddle, and continued up the trail. Abigail sat frozen for a moment. Her legs had been cramping for the last hour. She had been riding too short, anticipating a sudden bolt from the nervous mare. The adjustment immediately relieved the agonizing pressure in her knees. She stared at Caleb's broad back as he rode away. He hadn't hit her. He hadn't yelled. He had just fixed the problem. She swallowed hard, kicked the mare into a walk, and followed. They reached the cabin just as the last light bled out of the sky. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by ancient, towering pines. It wasn't a home, it was a fortress. Built from massive, unpeeled logs chinked with mud and horsehair, it had a heavy timber roof designed to hold feet of snow. A stone chimney leaned against one side, entirely utilitarian. Caleb dismounted and began stripping the gear off his horse. Abigail did the same, her fingers completely numb, fumbling with the heavy leather billets. Caleb opened the heavy oak door of the cabin. It didn't squeak. The hinges were heavily oiled. Abigail stepped inside. The air was colder inside than out. It smelled of old ash-tanned hides and stale coffee. It was a single room, roughly 15 by 20 feet. A cast-iron stove sat in the center. A heavy wooden table, scarred and battered, stood against one wall with a single chair. In the far corner was a bed frame made of stripped pine branches covered in thick bear and wolf pelts. There was nothing soft in the room. No curtains, no rugs, no pictures. It was a place for a man to survive, not to live. Caleb walked to the stove, opened the iron door, and quickly built a fire with dry kindling and birch bark. Within minutes, the metal began to tick and radiate heat. He stood up, walked to a shelf and grabbed a tin of coffee and a cast-iron skillet. He didn't ask her to cook. He didn't ask her to clean. He just went to work slicing thick cuts of salted pork and throwing them into the pan. Abigail stood awkwardly near the door, her Winchester still in her hand. She didn't know what to do. In her father's camp, women were expected to fetch, carry, and serve immediately. She tentatively leaned her rifle against the wall near the door, accessible, but not hostile. She took off her hat and coat, hanging them on a wooden peg. She walked over to the table and sat in the single chair. Caleb brought 2 tin plates over. He set one in front of her. It was piled high with sizzling, greasy pork and a hardtack biscuit. He took his own plate and sat on a wooden crate opposite her. They ate in silence. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the scrape of tin forks. Abigail chewed the tough meat, her eyes darting to Caleb every few seconds. He ate methodically, staring at the wall. When they finished, Abigail moved to take his plate to the wash basin. "Leave it," Caleb said. Abigail froze. "I can wash them. Water's frozen," he said. "Do it tomorrow." He stood up, grabbed an extra wool blanket from a chest at the foot of the bed, and threw it on the floor near the stove. He walked over to the oil lamp on the table and blew it out, plunging the room into darkness, save for the orange glow of the stove vents. Abigail heard the rustle of heavy canvas. She realized with a start that he was making a pallet on the floor. "The bed is yours." Caleb's voice drifted through the darkness. Abigail stood in the center of the dark room, her heart pounding. She had expected to be claimed. She had expected the brutal, drunken consummation of their transaction. That was how men were. She felt her way to the bed and sat on the edge of the heavy pelts. They were incredibly soft, incredibly warm. She lay back, keeping her boots on, keeping her clothes on. She stared at the ceiling, listening to the slow, steady breathing of the mountain man on the floor. He hadn't touched her. He hadn't demanded anything. For the first time in her life, Abigail felt entirely unmoored. She understood cruelty. She understood violence. She didn't understand this. 3 weeks passed. The mountain did not care about their marriage, nor did it care about the awkward tension inside the cabin. It only cared about winter, and winter was coming fast. Abigail learned quickly that survival here was a full-time occupation. There was no time for brooding. There was wood to chop meat, to smoke hides, to scrape, and water to haul from the half-frozen creek a 1/4 mile away. She threw herself into the work. She refused to be a burden. If she was a burden, she was expendable. That was the outlaw way. She woke before dawn, relit the stove, and had coffee boiling before Caleb even stirred from his pallet on the floor. They moved around each other like ghosts in the small cabin. Caleb spoke rarely. When he did, it was strictly utilitarian. Pass the salt. Snow's coming. Need more wood. He never asked about her past. He never mentioned brimstone. He just existed, a silent force of nature alongside the wind and the pines. Abigail watched him. She noticed the way he checked the perimeter of the cabin every night before dark, a habit born of a man who expected an ambush. She noticed the deep, jagged scar that ran from his left collarbone down into his shirt, a remnant of a blade or a bayonet. And she noticed that despite his massive size, he was startlingly gentle with his hands. She saw him spend 2 hours carefully carving a splint for a trapped rabbit's broken leg before setting it loose again. He was a contradiction, a killer's body with a monk's demeanor. One afternoon, the sky turned the color of bruised iron. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour. Caleb came through the door carrying a massive load of split pine. He dropped it hard into the wood box. "Storm," he said, shaking the first flakes of snow from his heavy coat. "A bad one. We don't go out for 3 days. Maybe 4. Abigail nodded. She had survived blizzards in the foothills, but the high Rockies were different. By nightfall, the wind sounded like a freight train roaring over the roof. The heavy logs of the cabin groaned in protest. The snow piled up against the single window, burying them in darkness. They were trapped. 15 feet by 20 feet. No escape. The tension in the room grew thick. Without the chores to distract them, the silence became deafening. Abigail sat at the table, a pile of torn wool in front of her. She was trying to mend one of Caleb's heavy winter shirts, her fingers clumsily maneuvering a bone needle. She wasn't a seamstress. She was a shooter. She jabbed the needle hard into the thick fabric mist and drove the sharp point deep into the fleshy part of her thumb. She hissed, dropping the shirt. Blood welled up, instantly dark and thick. She swore under her breath, wrapping her hand in a rag, trying to hide the mistake. Showing pain was showing weakness. Across the room, Caleb looked up from the harness he was oiling. He set the leather down and stood up. He walked over to the table. Abigail instinctively pulled her hand back, her shoulders tensing. She expected him to mock her clumsiness. Caleb reached out. He didn't grab her wrist. He just held his massive scarred hand, open palm up, silently asking her to offer hers. Abigail hesitated. She looked at his slate-grey eyes. They were unreadable, but they weren't angry. Slowly she uncurled her arm and placed her bleeding hand into his. His skin was rough, like heavily grit sandpaper, but his touch was incredibly light. He unwrapped the bloody rag. He examined the puncture wound. Then he turned and walked to the small wooden box where he kept his medical supplies. He returned with a clean strip of white cotton and a small jar of foul-smelling yellow salve. He pulled up a wooden crate and sat directly in front of her. Their knees almost touched. It was the closest they had been since the preacher's back room. He took her hand again. He smeared the cold salve over the wound. It stung fiercely, but Abigail didn't flinch. She kept her eyes on his face. "Needle slipped," she muttered, feeling the need to explain her failure. Caleb didn't look up. He began wrapping the cotton strip tightly around her thumb, tying it off with practiced efficiency. "Hands are cold," he said quietly. "I'm fine," she lied. Caleb finally looked up. He met her gaze. The silence stretched out, filled only by the screaming wind outside. "You don't have to be fine," he said. His voice was rough, rusted from disuse, but the words were clear. "Not here." Abigail swallowed hard. The cynical armor she had worn for 22 years felt like it was cracking just a fraction of an inch. She looked at this giant of a man, this silent killer who had bought her like property, and realized he wasn't looking at her as property at all. He was looking at her as a survivor, just like him. "My father." Abigail started the words spilling out before she could stop them. "He used to say that if you showed a man you were bleeding, he'd just aim for the wound next time." Caleb held her gaze. He didn't offer a platitude. He didn't tell her father was wrong. He just slowly released her hand. "I ain't your father." Caleb said, his voice a low rumble. "And I ain't aiming." He stood up, took the jar of salve, and walked back to his harness. Abigail sat at the table, looking at the neat white bandage on her thumb. The cabin was freezing, the storm was raging, and she was trapped on a mountain with a stranger. But for the first time in a very long time, Abigail didn't reach for her rifle. She just picked up the heavy wool shirt, held it close to the heat of the lamp, and carefully began to sew again. The storm raged for 4 days and 4 nights. It buried the cabin up to the eaves, sealing them inside a dark, claustrophobic box. They lived by the orange glow of the cast-iron stove, breathing air that grew thick with the smell of wood smoke, damp wool, and each other. Cabin fever usually drove men mad. In her father's camps, 3 days of rain meant drunken brawls and drawn knives. Here the silence simply deepened, shifting from a barrier into a shared language. Abigail learned Caleb's rhythms. He paced when his bad leg ached a slow, methodical circuit of the small room. He preferred his coffee scalded and bitter. He sharpened his skinning knife every evening, a repetitive scrape of steel on stone that became a strange, hypnotic lullaby. On the 5th night, the wind finally died. The sudden absence of sound was deafening. Abigail lay on the bed under the heavy pelts, staring at the ceiling joints. On the floor, Caleb slept fitfully. He usually slept like a stone dead to the world, but tonight he was restless. He muttered something low and guttural. Then he thrashed. His heavy boot kicked the metal leg of the stove. The clang rang out like a gunshot. Caleb surged upward with a roar. He didn't wake up slowly. He woke up violently, trapped in a memory. He threw the heavy canvas blanket off his massive hands, grasping at the empty air, searching for a rifle, a throat, a lifeline. "Get down!" he shouted, his voice cracking with a raw, desperate panic. "Incoming, get down!" He slammed his back against the log wall, his chest heaving, his eyes wide and unseeing in the dim light. He was back in the war. The timberline was gone. The cabin was gone. He was in the mud, smelling cordite and torn flesh. Abigail sat up. Fear spiked in her chest. A man that size lost in a waking nightmare could kill her without realizing she was there. Her father's men had woken up mean from the bottle. You never approached a mean drunk. You hid. But Caleb wasn't drunk. He was terrified. She swung her legs over the edge of the bed. She didn't reach for her Winchester. She kept her hands open, visible. "Caleb," she said. Her voice was steady, firm. He didn't hear her. He was breathing in ragged, shallow gasps, his hands balled into fists so tight his knuckles were white in the shadows. He was scanning the dark corners of the cabin, waiting for an attack. Abigail stood up. The floorboards were freezing against her stockinged feet. She took one step forward. "Caleb." she repeated slightly louder. "Look at the stove." His head snapped toward her, but his eyes were still blank wild. "Look at the stove!" Abigail commanded. She used the tone she used on nervous horses. Calm authority. "Smell the pine. There ain't no pine where you are right now. You're in the mountains. It's snowing." He blinked. The wildness in his eyes stuttered. She took another step. She was close enough to touch him now. She could smell the cold sweat soaking his shirt. "My name is Abigail," she said, her voice dropping to a low, rhythmic cadence. "You are in your cabin. The storm is over." Slowly, agonizingly, the tension began to drain from his shoulders. The rigid cords of muscle in his neck relaxed. His eyes focused, pulling away from the ghosts and locking onto her face. He looked down at his shaking hands. He unclenched them. He leaned his head back against the rough logs and let out a long, shuddering breath. "Shiloh," he whispered. The word sounded like ash in his mouth. Abigail nodded. She didn't offer pity. Pity was useless to a man like him. "It's gone," she said simply. Caleb looked at her. He saw her standing barefoot on the freezing floor, her thin nightdress offering no protection against the cold, putting herself in striking distance of a man having a violent fit. He didn't say thank you. He didn't apologize. He just reached out, gripped her shoulder gently with one heavy hand, and guided her back towards the bed. "Floor's cold," he muttered. He walked back to his pallet, pulled the canvas up, and lay down. He didn't thrash again. The next morning when Abigail woke, Caleb was already gone. The heavy door was cracked open, letting in a blinding shaft of sunlight reflecting off the snow. She walked outside. Caleb had spent the morning shoveling a path to the woodpile and the creek. He was currently standing near the tree line chopping wood with a rhythmic, powerful swing. Abigail watched him. The transaction was over. The bargain made in the sheriff's office had expired the moment he let her see his ghosts, and the moment she refused to run from them. They weren't strangers anymore. Winter held on for another month, fighting a losing battle against the lengthening days. When the thaw finally came, it was violent. The mountain shed its snow in massive roaring avalanches that shook the cabin's foundation. The creeks swelled into raging torrents of muddy, freezing water. Spring brought a different kind of hunger. The salt pork was gone. The hardtack was dusty and stale. They needed fresh meat. Caleb was busy repairing the roof, which had suffered under the weight of a late April blizzard. Abigail took her father's Winchester and headed down the eastern slope, looking for deer moving up from the valleys, to graze on the new chutes. The air smelled of wet earth and pine needles. The mud sucked at her boots, making every step a chore. She moved quietly, a skill honed from years of slipping past federal marshals and angry posies. She tracked a small buck for 2 miles, finally catching it in a clearing near a swollen stream. She dropped it with a single shot to the heart. It was a clean kill. She gutted the animal quickly, her hands slick with hot blood, tying the legs together to hoist it over her shoulders for the brutal hike back. She went to wash her hands in the stream. The water was numbing. As she crouched by the bank, scrubbing the blood from beneath her fingernails, she saw them. Tracks. Not deer. Not bear. Not Caleb's smooth, worn moccasin boots. These were heavy leather boots with a pronounced heel. Riding boots. 3 sets of them. They were fresh, the mud still oozing slowly into the deep impressions. Beside the boot prints were the unmistakable crescent shapes of iron horseshoes. Brimstone didn't send men up this high in the spring. Trappers moved alone, not in packs of 3. Abigail knelt over the tracks. She traced the edge of one boot print. A distinct notch was missing from the heel. Her blood ran colder than the mountain water. She knew that boot. It belonged to Dutch Vander. He was her father's second-in-command. A ruthless, smiling man who liked his whiskey cheap and his cruelty slow. Dutch had been the one to tip off the sheriff about Josiah's location. He had sold her father out for a pardon, and now he was up here. Dutch didn't want revenge. He wanted the Union Pacific payroll map. Josiah had hidden the stolen gold before the posse caught him. Dutch believed Abigail knew where it was. She stood up. The deer meat was suddenly meaningless. She grabbed her Winchester, levered around into the chamber, and ran. She abandoned stealth. She tore through the underbrush, her lungs burning branches whipping across her face and tearing at her clothes. If they found the cabin before she did. If they caught Caleb unaware on the roof. She burst into the clearing, gasping for air. Caleb was standing by the wood chopping block, an axe resting easily in his hand. He took one look at her pale, scratched face, and the blood on her clothes, and his entire demeanor shifted. The quiet trapper vanished. The soldier from Shiloh returned. 3 riders. Abigail panted, doubling over her hands on her knees. Coming up the eastern draw. It's Dutch Vander, my father's gang. Caleb didn't ask questions. He didn't ask what Dutch wanted. He simply dropped the axe and walked swiftly into the cabin. Abigail followed. Caleb was already pulling a heavy Sharps buffalo rifle from under the bed. He tossed Abigail a canvas bandolier heavy with .44 caliber rounds for her Winchester. "They track you?" he asked, his voice low, lacking any inflection of panic. "No. Found their trail by the creek. They're heading for the main ridge approach. They'll be here in 20 minutes. Caleb nodded. He walked to the window, knocking out the wooden wedges that held the heavy shutters open, pulling them almost shut, leaving only a 2-inch gap. He moved to the door, dropping a massive oak bar across the frame. "You know how they fight," Caleb said, looking at her. "Tell me." "Dutch is a coward. He'll hang back. He'll send the other 2 in to flush us out. If they think we're scared, they'll burn the cabin." "We ain't scared," Caleb said. He moved a heavy sack of flour from the shelf and dropped it in front of the window gap, creating a sandbag. He gestured for Abigail to take the position. "Shoot the first man who draws," Caleb instructed. "Don't wait for them to speak. Men who talk, die." He grabbed his Sharps, checked the breech, and climbed up a small wooden ladder that led to a narrow loft beneath the rafters. He pushed open a small concealed flap in the roof, giving him a commanding view of the clearing and the tree line. Abigail knelt by the window, resting the cold barrel of her Winchester on the flour sack. Her thumb rested on the hammer. Her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had spent her whole life running from violence. Now she was barricaded in a log cabin, waiting for it to arrive. She looked up at the dark loft. Caleb was a shadow up there, completely silent, utterly deadly. He hadn't asked her to leave. He hadn't blamed her for bringing trouble to his door. He just loaded his gun. The silence of the mountain stretched tight like a wire about to snap. Then she heard it, the heavy rhythmic squelch of hooves in the spring mud. They rode into the clearing arrogantly, making no attempt to hide their approach. 3 men on exhausted, mud-splattered horses. The man in the center was Dutch Vander. He wore a heavy wool duster and a bowler hat that looked ridiculous in the high country. His face was a map of broken blood vessels, framed by a greasy, blonde beard. Flanking him were 2 hired guns Abigail didn't recognize, hard-eyed men, with their coats swept back to expose low-slung revolvers. Dutch halted his horse 30 yards from the cabin door. He leaned on the saddle horn, spitting a stream of dark tobacco juice into the pristine snowmelt. "Abigail!" Dutch shouted. His voice echoed off the pines, sharp and ugly. "I know you're in there, saw your little tracks down by the creek. Put the kettle on. We need to have a family chat about your daddy's retirement fund." Abigail's grip tightened on the Winchester. Through the narrow slit of the shutters, she had a perfect view of the man on Dutch's left. He was nervously chewing his lip, his hand hovering over the grip of his Colt. "I brought friends, Abby," Dutch called out, feigning joviality. "Don't make us kick this door and your new husband ain't gotta get hurt. We just want the map and we'll ride out." Silence answered him. Dutch's smile vanished. He nodded to the two men. "Burn them out." The man on the left spurred his horse forward, drawing a heavy revolver from his hip. He didn't even get the barrel raised. The roar of Caleb Sharp's rifle from the roof was deafening. It sounded like a cannon firing in the enclosed space of the clearing. The massive .50 caliber slug hit the rider dead in the chest. The impact lifted him entirely out of the saddle, throwing him backward into the mud with a wet, heavy thud. His horse reared screaming and bolted into the trees. Chaos erupted. The second hired gun shouted in panic, spurring his horse violently to the right, aiming his revolver at the roof. Abigail didn't hesitate. She stood up slightly, tracking the man through the window slit. She exhaled, squeezed the trigger, and felt the familiar, heavy kick of the Winchester against her shoulder. Her bullet caught the man in the thigh. He screamed, dropping his gun. He slumped forward, grabbing his horse's mane, desperately trying to stay mounted as the animal panicked and spun in circles. Dutch was already moving. He was a coward, but he was a survivor. The moment the Sharps fired, he spurred his horse toward the cover of the woodpile, drawing his own rifle from its scabbard. He threw himself off the moving horse, sliding behind the massive stack of split pine. "You crazy bitch!" Dutch screamed from behind the logs. He blindly fired a shot toward the window. The bullet splintered the heavy oak shutter, sending a shower of sharp wood fragments into Abigail's cheek. She flinched, blood welling up from a shallow cut, but she didn't stop racking the lever of her rifle. "He's behind the woodpile!" Abigail yelled up to the loft. "I see him!" Caleb's voice was a low rumble, calm amidst the ringing echoes of gunfire. The Sharps roared again. The heavy slug slammed into the woodpile, obliterating a thick pine log and showering Dutch in splinters. Dutch shrieked, firing wildly back at the roofline. Abigail pushed the shutter open another inch. She could see Dutch's boot protruding from the edge of the woodpile. She took aim, but before she could fire, Dutch made a desperate play. He realized he was pinned. The man on the roof couldn't hit him solidly through the wood, but he couldn't stay there forever. Dutch pulled a glass bottle from his duster lamp oil. He stuffed a rag into the neck, struck a match on his boot heel, and lit it. He was going to throw it at the dry, winter-brittle thatch of the cabin's porch overhang. "He's got fire!" Abigail screamed. Dutch stepped out from cover, his arm cocked back to throw. He never completed the motion. Abigail's Winchester cracked. The bullet shattered the glass bottle in Dutch's hand. The burning rag met the exploding lamp oil. A sheet of liquid fire engulfed Dutch's right arm and chest. He dropped his rifle, howling in absolute agony, batting at the flames, consuming his heavy wool coat. He stumbled blindly out into the open mud of the clearing, a screaming torch. Caleb didn't let him suffer. The Sharps boomed a third time. Dutch's head snapped back, and he collapsed face first into the freezing mud. The fire sputtered and died, suffocated by the wet earth. The clearing fell deathly silent, save for the frantic whinnying of the riderless horses in the distant trees. Abigail stayed frozen by the window, the barrel of her rifle smoking. Her hands were shaking violently. The adrenaline crash hit her like a physical blow. Her ears were ringing so loudly she could barely hear her own breathing. She heard the heavy thud of Caleb's boots coming down the ladder. He walked over to the door, lifted the heavy oak bar, and stepped outside. Abigail slowly stood up and followed him, her legs feeling like water. The spring sun was high and bright, making the blood in the mud look impossibly red. Caleb walked over to the man he had shot first. Dead. He walked over to Dutch. Dead. The third man had vanished into the timberline, bleeding from the leg. He wouldn't last the night in the cold, and he wouldn't come back. Caleb turned and looked at Abigail. He saw the blood dripping from the shallow splinter cut on her cheek. He walked toward her. He didn't look at the bodies. He only looked at her. He reached out, taking a clean kerchief from his pocket, and gently wiped the blood from her face. His hand was steady. You hold your ground," Caleb said softly. It wasn't a compliment. It was a recognition of fact, an acknowledgement of an equal. Abigail leaned into his touch just for a fraction of a second. She looked at the bodies of the men who had come to take her life, and then at the massive, quiet man who had stood beside her to defend it. "I'm done running," Abigail said, her voice raspy but firm. "This is my home." Caleb lowered the kerchief. The faintest ghost of a smile touched the corners of his eyes beneath the heavy brim of his hat. "I'll get a shovel," he said. The ground was a liar. On the surface, the spring sun had turned the topsoil into a thick, sucking mud. But 2 feet down the mountain held on to winter with an iron grip. The earth was a frozen matrix of granite chunks and ice-hardened clay. Caleb swung the heavy iron pickaxe. The metal sparked against a buried stone, sending a sharp, percussive crack echoing through the pines. He grunted, adjusting his grip, and swung again. Abigail stood at the edge of the growing pit, leaning on a long-handled shovel. Her arms burned. Blisters had formed, popped, and reformed on her palms. She watched Caleb work. His shirt was soaked with sweat clinging to the thick slabs of muscle across his back. His left leg, the bad one, was heavily favored. He wasn't indestructible. The frantic violence of the morning and the brutal labor of the afternoon were wearing him down. "Let me take a turn," Abigail said. Her voice was raspy from the cordite smoke that still hung faintly in the cabin's air. Caleb didn't stop swinging. "Ground's too hard. It'll jar your teeth loose." "I ain't made of glass." He stopped. He leaned on the pickaxe handle, breathing heavily, and looked at her. He saw the dirt smeared across her forehead, the shallow, crusted cut on her cheek, and the fierce, uncompromising set of her jaw. He nodded, stepping back, and tossed the pickaxe onto the pile of excavated dirt. Abigail jumped down into the waist-deep hole. She picked up the heavy tool. It weighed twice as much as her Winchester. She raised it over her head and brought it down. The impact traveled up the wooden handle, rattling her bones, but she bit her lip and swung again. She imagined Hoyt's face on the rocks. She imagined her father's grinning, selfish face. She swung until her vision blurred and her breath tasted like copper. Caleb watched her for a long time. When her swings began to grow shallow and wild, he reached down, grabbed her by the heavy canvas belt of her skirt, and hoisted her out of the hole with one arm. "Deep enough," he said. "Wolves won't dig through the ice line." They dragged the bodies over one by one. They didn't speak words over them. Men like Dutch Vander didn't earn prayers, and Abigail had none left to give. While Caleb rolled Dutch's charred, rigid body into the far corner of the pit, his foot caught the edge of the dead man's heavy wool duster. The coat tore open. A small, blood-soaked square of oiled canvas slipped from the inner pocket and fell onto the dirt. Abigail saw it. She knelt, ignoring the metallic smell of blood and burnt hair, and picked it up. She unfolded the stiff canvas. Inside was a piece of heavy brown butcher paper folded tight. She smoothed it out against her knee. It was a map, rough pencil lines detailing a section of the Red Creek Valley about 30 miles south of Brimston. A black X was marked near a geological formation labeled the Chimneys. At the bottom, in the jagged, familiar scrawl of Josiah, were the words UP Freight, 12,000 gold, $12,000. More money than a working man could see in 10 lifetimes. It was the Union Pacific payroll. The reason her father was dead? The reason Dutch had come up the mountain? Caleb climbed out of the grave. He picked up his shovel and began pushing the dirt back in. He didn't look at the paper in her hand. "It's the map," Abigail said. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the sound of the falling earth. "My father's stash. Dutch found it on him before the posse took him." Caleb paused. He looked at the map, then at Abigail's face. He saw the calculation in her eyes. $12,000 could buy a lot. It could buy a train ticket to San Francisco. It could buy a new name. It could buy a life completely insulated from cold hunger and violence. 12,000, Abigail said, staring at the penciled lines. Caleb turned back to the grave. He drove his shovel into the dirt pile. Money that heavy always comes with blood on it. It's enough to leave, she said, testing the words, testing him. Enough to get off this mountain, away from the snow. Caleb stopped shoveling. He didn't turn around. His broad shoulders remained rigid. He had bought her life for $50 to save her from the gallows, but he couldn't buy her loyalty. He knew that. He was a realistic man. He was a scarred, silent trapper who offered nothing but a hard life in a high, lonely place. If she wanted to go, she had the means now. You got a horse? Caleb said, quietly, his voice devoid of emotion. You know the trail down. The weather's broke. You won't freeze. He went back to filling the grave. Abigail stood motionless. She looked at the map. She imagined the gold. Then she looked at the cabin. She looked at the fresh wood Caleb had chopped. She looked at the man who had stood on a roof and pulled a trigger to keep her breathing. A civilized man would have begged her to stay. A greedy man would have demanded the map and killed her for it. Caleb simply opened the door and let her choose. She walked over to the edge of the grave. She held the map out over the dark pit right above Dutch Vander's unseeing face. She let go. The brown paper fluttered down, landing lightly on the dead man's chest. Caleb paused, his shovel hovering in the air. He looked down at the map, then up at Abigail. His slate-grey eyes were wide, betraying a flicker of genuine shock. You said it yourself, Abigail said, picking up her own shovel. Money that heavy comes with blood. I've washed enough blood out of men's shirts for one lifetime. I ain't starting again. She drove her shovel into the dirt and threw a heavy spadeful over the map, burying the gold, the past, and her father's ghost in one swift motion. Caleb stared at her for a long moment. The tightness in his jaw relaxed. The distance in his eyes vanished. He didn't smile. He wasn't a man given to grand displays, but he gave a single, slow nod. They finished burying the dead together. Summer arrived on the mountain with a sudden vicious heat. The snowmelt dried up, leaving the high meadows brittle and brown. The air grew thin and baked, smelling of dry pine needles and dust. They settled into a rhythm that went beyond mere survival. They operated as a single entity. Caleb hunted. Abigail smoked the meat. Abigail foraged for wild onions and bitterroot. Caleb mended the roof and reinforced the heavy doors. They spoke more now, though never in long paragraphs. They communicated in the shorthand of people who completely trust each other. A look, a nod, a slight shift in posture. But the mountain could not keep the world at bay forever. In late August, Caleb found a dead calf elk near the lower eastern ridge. It hadn't been killed by wolves or a mountain lion. It had been shot. The bullet had taken it high in the gut, a sloppy, careless shot. The animal had run for miles before collapsing in the brush. Caleb knelt by the carcass, digging the slug out of the rotting meat with his hunting knife. He wiped the blood off the misshapen piece of lead and held it up to the harsh sunlight. It was a .45 caliber pistol slug. Trappers carried rifles. Cowboys carried rifles. Men who rode in poses, men who expected close-quarters gunfights in saloons and alleyways carried heavy revolvers. Caleb returned to the cabin. He walked through the door and tossed the lead slug onto the scarred wooden table. It hit the wood with a heavy thwack. Abigail was kneading dough. She stopped wiping her flour-covered hands on her apron. She looked at the bullet, her stomach plummeting. She knew exactly what it meant. How many sets of tracks? She asked. 4, Caleb said, walking over to the Winchester, leaning by the door and checking the action. Horses are heavily shod, riding in a straight line, sweeping the draws. They ain't hunting game. They're hunting a cabin. Hoyt! Abigail breathed. Sheriff Hoyt wasn't a fool. Dutch Vander and his men had disappeared into the high country and never come back. Hoyt knew about the $50 Caleb had paid. He knew Caleb took Josiah's daughter. Hoyt, greedy and patient, had put the pieces together. He had waited for the snow to melt, gathered a posse of deputies who didn't ask questions, and come to collect the $12,000 he believed Abigail was hiding. "They'll be here by nightfall," Caleb said. He pulled the heavy sharps from under the bed and began stuffing brass cartridges into a canvas bandolier. "We fight them here," Abigail said, reaching for her rifle. "We did it before. Dutch was a drunk and a fool," Caleb countered, strapping the bandolier across his massive chest. "Hoyt is law. He brings deputies. They won't charge the clearing. They'll set up on the ridge. They'll wait until dark, and they'll burn us out while covering the door. We stay in this box, we die." Abigail looked around the small cabin. It had become her sanctuary. The thought of losing it made her throat tight with rage. "So what do we do? Run?" "No," Caleb said. He looked at her. His eyes cold and flat. The soldier was back. "We hunt." They left the cabin within the hour, taking only their rifles, ammunition, and canteens. They didn't take the horses. Horses were loud and large targets. They moved on foot, slipping into the dense pine forest like shadows. Caleb knew the mountain the way a man knows the lines on his own palms. He led her away from the main trails, moving parallel to the approach Hoyt's men would have to take. The heat was oppressive. Flies buzzed relentlessly in the still air. 2 hours later, they heard them. The sound of breaking brush and men cursing heavily. Caleb dropped to a crouch, gesturing for Abigail to do the same. They crept to the edge of a steep granite drop-off. Below them was a narrow, rocky draw that funneled toward the eastern ridge approach. 4 riders were making their way up the draw. They were sweating through their shirts, their horses lathered and miserable. Leading them was Sheriff Hoyt. He looked entirely out of place, wearing a dusty black suit coat, despite the heat, a silver star pinned to his lapel catching the sun. Beside him rode 3 hard-eyed men carrying repeater rifles across their saddles. "I'm telling you, Sheriff," one of the men grumbled, wiping his neck with a dirty bandana. "This is a fool's errand. The girl probably slipped down the other side of the pass months ago. She didn't—" Hoyt snapped, his voice carrying clearly up the rocky walls of the draw. "Hayes is territorial. He wouldn't let property wander off, and the girl knows where Josiah hid the UP gold. Dutch was too stupid to get it out of her. We'll just arrest Hayes for the murder of Dutch Vander, hang him from his own roof beam, and have a long, quiet talk with the girl." Abigail felt a cold fury settle in her chest. She raised her Winchester, resting the barrel on a flat piece of granite. She sighted down the barrel, placing the brass bead directly between Hoyt's shoulder blades. She could end it right now. One twitch of her finger. Caleb reached out and placed his heavy hand over the receiver of her rifle, pushing the barrel down gently. She looked at him angry. "4 men!" Caleb whispered, his mouth right next to her ear. "You drop Hoyt, the other 3 scatter into the rocks. They have the high ground on the draw. It becomes a siege. We don't have the water for a siege." "Then how?" she asked, her grip white-knuckled on the stock. "We give them what they want," Caleb said. "We give them the gold." Abigail stared at him. "I buried the map. I don't know where it is." "I do," Caleb said flatly. Abigail blinked. "You read it before I dropped it?" "Didn't have to," Caleb said, his eyes tracking the riders below. "I know the chimneys. There's an old silver shaft down there, deep, dangerous. Used to use it to shelter from blizzards years ago. If Josiah wanted to hide heavy saddlebags from a posse, that's the only hole in that valley deep enough." "It's 30 miles south," Abigail whispered. "We cut across the ridge," Caleb said. "We move through the night. We beat them there. When Hoyt realizes we ain't at the cabin, he'll track us. He'll follow us right to the hole." It was a terrifying gamble. They were intentionally leading armed lawmen away from their fortified home and into the open valleys. But Caleb was right. If they fought here, they might kill Hoyt, but they would likely die in the process. They backed away from the ledge and turned south. They began the punishing trek across the high peaks. They walked through the blinding heat of the afternoon and into the freezing dark of the mountain night. Caleb moved relentlessly, ignoring the obvious pain in his bad leg. Abigail kept pace, her boots grinding blisters into her heels, her lungs burning in the thin air. She didn't complain. The outlaw's daughter knew how to suffer. By dawn they had descended below the timberline into the Red Creek Valley. The terrain shifted from granite and pine to red dirt sagebrush and towering sandstone pillars. The chimneys loomed ahead, massive spires of red rock jutting out of the earth like broken teeth. At the base of the largest spire was a dark, jagged tear in the rock face. The abandoned silver mine. They reached the entrance just as the sun crested the horizon, painting the desert floor in violent shades of orange and blood red. Caleb didn't stop to rest. He walked into the pitch-black maw of the mine. The air inside was dead, smelling of ancient dust and decay. He struck a match, the sudden flare blinding in the gloom, and lit a small stub of a candle he had taken from his pack. The floor of the shaft was littered with fallen rock and rotted timber. They walked back about 50 yards until the shaft ended in a sheer drop-off, a secondary shaft plunging straight down into the blackness. Spanning the drop-off was a single terrifyingly narrow plank of ancient splintered wood. And sitting on a rocky ledge on the far side of the gap, covered in 2 inches of undisturbed dust, were 2 heavy leather saddlebags. Josiah's stash. Abigail stared at the bags. $12,000 in gold coin. It had cost her father his life. It had cost 3 train guards their lives. It had brought a war to Caleb's mountain. "It's real," she whispered. "Don't matter if it's real," Caleb said, blowing out the candle. He drew his hunting knife. "It's bait." They waited in the valley's oppressive heat for 2 days. They hid among boulders above the mine entrance, drinking sparingly. They watched the northern trail. That afternoon, a dust cloud appeared. Hoyt and his men rode into the shadow. They looked exhausted. Their horses stumbled. Hoyt dismounted, drawing his revolver. He looked at the mine entrance, then at the dirt. "Tracks lead right in." Hoyt rasped, his voice ruined by dust and thirst. "They're trapped. You 2 take the perimeter. Miller, come with me. Light a lantern." Caleb and Abigail watched from 40 feet above. "Now," Caleb whispered. He stood on the ledge, picked up a massive sandstone chunk, and hurled it down. The rock smashed into the dirt 10 feet from Hoyt's horse. The animal shrieked and bolted, tearing the reins from Hoyt. Hoyt whipped around, aiming his pistol up at the rocks. There's gunfire erupted. The 2 perimeter deputies fired their repeaters wildly at the ledge. Bullets chipped the sandstone, sending deadly shards of rock flying. Caleb ducked back. "Stay down," he ordered Abigail. He brought his heavy rifle to his shoulder, pivoting around the edge of a boulder. The booming roar of the buffalo gun echoed off the sandstone spires like thunder. The shot caught one of the perimeter deputies in the shoulder, spinning him violently to the ground. "Spread out!" Hoyt screamed, scrambling for cover near the mine entrance. "Keep them pinned!" The remaining uninjured deputy and the wounded man laid down suppressive fire. Bullets snapped over Caleb and Abigail's heads like angry hornets. The sheer volume of lead tore their cover apart. "We need to move," Caleb grunted, reloading with mechanical efficiency. "They're going to flank us. I have an angle on the mine entrance," Abigail said. She pressed her cheek against the hot rock, peering through a narrow gap, her Winchester sighted on the space where Hoyt had vanished. "Wait for him to break cover," Caleb said. He leaned out to fire again. As he did, a bullet from the ridge ricocheted off the boulder next to his head. The flattened piece of lead spalled, sending a jagged fragment tearing through the thick muscle of Caleb's left bicep. Caleb flinched. A sharp hiss escaped his teeth. The heavy rifle slipped from his grip, clattering against the rock. Blood instantly bloomed hot and dark, soaking his sleeve. "Caleb!" Abigail abandoned her angle, scrambling toward him. "I'm fine," he growled, grabbing his arm. His face went pale beneath the dirt. "Don't break your line of sight." It was too late. Seeing Caleb drop his weapon, Hoyt made his move. He didn't run away. He ran directly into the dark entrance of the mine. "He's going for the bags," Abigail realized. Hoyt was willing to risk the dark and the drop-off to get his hands on the gold before the gunfight ended. Abigail looked at Caleb. His arm was useless. The deputies were laying down heavy fire, keeping them pinned. If Hoyt got the gold, he wouldn't leave. He would wait inside until the deputies killed them or they died of thirst. She made a choice. It wasn't the choice of a scared girl from Brimston. It was the choice of a mountain woman. "Cover me," Abigail said. She didn't wait for Caleb to argue. She grabbed her Winchester, leaped up from the rocks, and sprinted down the steep shale path toward the mine entrance. "Abigail!" Caleb roared. He grabbed his Colt revolver with his good hand and began firing blindly to keep the deputies' heads down. Abigail hit the valley floor running. Bullets kicked up red dust at her heels. She ignored them. She kept her eyes locked on the hole. She threw herself through the entrance, rolling hard onto the dusty floor of the mine tunnel. She plunged into instant suffocating darkness. The gunfire outside became muffled, replaced by her own ragged breathing echoing off the stone walls. She stood up slowly, keeping her back pressed against the cold rock. Far down the tunnel, she saw a flickering pale yellow light. Hoyt had lit a lantern. Abigail moved forward, silent in her soft-soled boots. She crept closer. The faint light illuminated the cavernous room at the end of the shaft. Hoyt stood at the edge of the chasm. The sickly yellow glow revealed the narrow, rotting plank spanning the gap. On the other side sat the saddlebags. Hoyt stepped onto the narrow plank. The ancient wood groaned. Abigail stepped out from the shadows into the lantern light. She raised her Winchester. "Step back, Hoyt," she said. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. Hoyt froze. He slowly turned his head. "Little Abby, play an outlaw just like Daddy." "Drop the gun," she commanded. Hoyt sneered. "You won't